لله الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن هذا القرآن يهدي للتي هي أقوم صدق الله مولانا العظيم. Respected listeners, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the 13th of Ramadan, 1446, Yawm al-Jumu'ah, and we are continuing with our presentation or topic on a Muslim's personal relationship with the Qur'an. So last week we touched on the 4 relationships which we want to cover during the 4 Jumu'ahs of Ramadan this year, and each relationship on a separate Jumu'ah. So last week we touched on the physical and emotional relationship that we need to establish with the Qur'an. And then today, inshallah ta'ala, we will speak on the spiritual side of it. But under physical, emotional, just to recap the memories, we stated about the emotional and physical relationship. Part of it is where you approach the Qur'an in a state of purity. You show respect sometimes by kissing the Qur'an, and we gave the example of Ikrimah bin Abi Jahl, the son of Abu Jahl, radiallahu anhu. And we also spoke about how people cry when they listen to the recitation of the Qur'an and other forms of respect. So all of this relates to our physical and emotional relationship with the Qur'an. So today we want to focus on how do we establish or how do we develop a spiritual relationship with the Qur'an. So the way you do that is by recitation of the Qur'an. When you start engaging in the recitation of the Qur'an, you are now on the journey of establishing a spiritual relationship with the Qur'an and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And why we say this is because the Qur'an is the best form of dhikr. وَلَذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ. And the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest. And there can be no better form of dhikr than the Qur'an. And that is why you will see as we go into the presentation from the Salaf, how they used to commit to recitation of the Qur'an throughout the year, and especially in the month of Ramadan. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَتَطْمَئِنُّ قُلُوبُهُمْ بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ أَلَا بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَطْمَئِنُّ الْقُلُوبُ. Those who believe and whose hearts find satisfaction in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Unquestionably, in the remembrance of Allah ta'ala do hearts find satisfaction. And each one can relate to this because you experience this. You experience it when you are reciting the noble Qur'an, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what we want to cover in today's presentation is what do we recite of the Qur'an? When do we recite? Do we recite with understanding or without understanding? Is there merits if you're reading with understanding only, or is there also merits if you're reading without understanding? So this is what we want to try and cover in today's presentation, inshallah ta'ala. So when it comes to the when and what pertaining to recitation, obviously one is you recite in salah. So you could do Qiyamul Layl, you could do Taraweeh, and you could go home and do additional rakats of Qiyamul Layl. And in the Qiyamul Layl, what do? Recitation of Qur'an. And the Prophet ﷺ gave us different options. You know, for those who know more of the Qur'an, they can recite more. Who know less, they recite less. Okay, to such an extent, some of the madhab also allow holding the Qur'an in the hand and doing Taraweeh. If you're not a hafid of the Qur'an. So that you will find the different schools of thought, who some agree with it, some don't. But the point is that in Salah, you are doing recitation of the Qur'an. And then we look at, and remember we're not only talking of Ramadan here, when we're talking of recitation of Qur'an and the spiritual relationship with Allah, or with the Qur'an is not only confined to Ramadan, but because it is the month of Ramadan, obviously we will speak a lot about it. Then it comes to daily recitation, for example, Surah Yasin. Now we know there's a lot of ikhtilaf and differences with the authenticity of it, but there is a sahih and authentic narration which is mawqufan from Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. And that one is acceptable by the scholars of hadith, but it's mawqufan, where he says if you commit to the recitation of Surah Yasin during the day, Allah will give you protection throughout the day. When you do it in the evening, Allah will give you protection throughout the evening. That one is sahih, authentic, from Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. So there is some merits in it. Then Surah Al-Mulk, etc. and other surahs that people recite. Okay, so this is like on a daily basis, you commit to the recitation of Qur'an. Also you have Ayatul Kursi, which is the greatest verse of the Qur'an. So the Prophet said, when you go to bed, recite Ayatul Kursi, for they will remain with you a guardian from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and no devil will approach you until morning comes. The last two verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, whoever recites the last two verses of Surah Al-Baqarah at night, they will suffice for him. And it is appropriate to recite it before you retire to bed. There are narrations from the Prophet ﷺ and even from the Sahaba, Ridwanullahi alayhim ajma'in, where they spoke highly about the closing verses of Surah Al-Baqarah to be recited before you retire to bed. And then we have the Mu'awwizat, the three quls, where the Prophet said you should recite it after Farz Salah, after every Farz Salah. You should recite it before you sleep and blow onto yourself. You should recite it on the sick and blow on them. 3 times in the morning, 3 times in the evening. So all of these virtues and merits come in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that encourages us to do recitation of the noble Qur'an. And then you got the 4th qul, which is Surah Al-Kafirun, where the Prophet said that whoever recites Qul Ya Ayyuhal Kafirun and then goes to sleep at the end of it, then it will be bari'un min ash-shirk, disavowal of shirk. It will free you from shirk. Okay, and then we move on to occasional recitation. So we did the one in Salah, daily recitation, occasional recitation of the Qur'an. For example, today is Yawm al-Jumu'ah. From after sunset yesterday, you got till before the sun sets today. That is Jumu'ah for us. You must recite Surah Al-Kahf. So every week you commit to the recitation of Surah Al-Kahf. And the virtues, obviously we don't want to go into the virtues because of the time factor. And then we come on to Khatm al-Qur'an, where you make Khatm of the Qur'an. You complete the entire Qur'an. Now here what you will find, there are narrations that speak about 3 days, 7 days, 10 days, 15 days, 20 days, and 1 month. Whether it is in Ramadan or out of Ramadan. And the Prophet said in a hadith, اقرأ القرآن في كل شهر. This is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that recite the Qur'an every month. What he meant, make khatam of the Qur'an every month. This was his instruction to us. So whenever he said this hadith, because the question is, if he said every month, how do we have 3 days, 7 days, 10, 15, 20? So whenever he said this hadith, the Sahaba had so much of enthusiasm within themselves. They would always tell the Prophet, أَنَا أَقْوَى مِنْ ذَلِكَ إِنِّي أُتِيكُ أَكْثَرَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ أُتِيكُ أَكْثَرَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ أُتِيكُ أَفْضَلَ مِنْ ذَلِكَ. These are the words they used to tell him. So much of zeal and enthusiasm they had. So he's telling them, recite, make 1 khatam of the Quran in 30 days, 1 month, 29 or 30 days. But what are they telling the Prophet ﷺ? We have the ability and potential to do more. In other words, we can make khatam of Quran in less than that. Then for some you would say, okay, 20 days. Some would say 15 days. Some would say 10 days. Some 7 days. And then he put a block, he said on 3 days. But he said not less than 3 days. So what you see here, the manzil, in the 39 Quran that you find today, you will find there's 7 manazil. Because 7 days was a common practice of the Sahaba, also many Sahaba, and throughout the Salaf, that they used to complete the Qur'an in 7 days. Because of that, you'll find in your Qur'an there's 7 manazil, and all is given from which surah to which surah. But the very practical thing is to do it one khatam in 1 month, and this is what the Prophet loved, that moderation. That you have the whole month and you recite, you do the Khatm al-Quran during that month, whether it is Ramadan or out of Ramadan. It's just that in the month of Ramadan, because it is the month of Qur'an, the month of fasting, people commit more to the recitation of Qur'an. So that's why we look at this enthusiasm of the Sahaba Ridwanullah Ajma'in. When the Rasul would tell them to make Khatam of the Qur'an every month, they would always reply by saying they can do more than that. In other words, make Khatam in less than a month. Hence the different number of days appear in the hadith, 3, 7 and so forth. However, less than 3 days was discouraged. The reason for that is because the Prophet said, لَمْ يَفْقَهْ مَنْ قَرَأَ الْقُرْآنِ فِي أَقَلِّ مِنْ ثَلَاثٍ. That you will not be able to understand the Qur'an if you try and make Khatam less than 3 days, because it will be done in a very rushed way. For that reason, you find Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he said, اقرأوا القرآن في سبع ولا تقرأوا في أقل من ثلاث. That recite the Quran in 7 days, but don't do it less than 3 days. Mu'adh bin Jabal radiallahu anhu, أنه كان يكره أن يقرأ القرآن في أقل من ثلاث. He said it is makruh, dislike, to complete the Quran, to make khatam less than 3 days. And Ibn Kathir said, وَقَدْ كَرِهَ غَيْرُ وَاحِدْ مِنَ السَّلَفِ قراءة القرآن في أقل من ثلاث كما هو مذهب أبو عبيد وإسحاق بن راهوية وغيرهما من الخلف أيضا. So for that reason, of this hadith of the Prophet, you can see what was the opinion of many Sahaba. But what we find, especially in the month of Ramadan, people do Khatmul Quran less than 3 days. So how do you answer this? There seems to be a contradiction. For example, you have Qatada radiallahu anhu, where you see every 2 nights during the last 10 days of Ramadan, he's making Khatam of Quran. Ebrahim Nakha'i, in the last 10 days, every 2 nights, he's making Khatam of Quran. You look at Al-Aswad, every 2 nights throughout the month of Ramadan, he's making Khatam of Quran. So the answer the scholars give is that they made Ramzan an exception. Because it was the month of Quran, that is why they did Khatm al-Quran less than 3 days. They made it a month of exception. But throughout the year, the other days, they would not go less than 3 days. 3 days would be the starting point and move up. So this is how you reconcile between what the Prophet is saying and when you look at some of the practice, especially amongst from the time of the Tabi'een. Then why did they then commit to the recitation of Quran less than 3 days? So this is the answer the scholars give in order to reconcile that question that is arising. And this is the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ speaks about our relationship with the Quran in terms of recitation in Ramadan. We speak of the generosity of the Prophet ﷺ. This hadith is speaking about his generosity with the Quran in the month of Ramadan, where Jibreel used to visit him and recite the Quran, and he made 2 khatams the year that he passed away. So this was his what? Ajwad al-nas in terms of what? Generosity with the Quran. This is what the hadith speaks. And this is the hadith that motivated many of the Tabi'een later on to make khatam upon khatam in the month of Ramadan. Because this hadith speaks about the Prophet ﷺ's generosity towards the Quran in the month of Ramadan. So if you look at a 30-day, 30 days according to the moon, that alhamdulillah, Sheikh Imran has this beautiful methodology where he structured it according to each day. You begin with Surah Fatiha and which surahs you recite. When you go back to the 7 manazil we spoke about, the 7 manzils, even that you will find when the Sahaba recited, they always recited the complete surah. They didn't break the surah, what Shaykh Imran always emphasizes upon. You don't break the surah when you're doing your personal recitation. And if you look at the 7 manazil, wallahi, it's in harmony what he says. They never ever broke a surah. They always started and ended the surah, and maybe added a surah, but never broke a surah in between. So this is how you then relate to the lunar calendar or the lunar year when you make Khatm al-Quran in this manner. Okay, we conclude the presentation with recitation should be done with understanding or without understanding. So first of all, we must realize that there are two types of qira'ah, recitation. One is called tadhakkuri, which can be translated in English as superficial recitation. One is tadabburi, contemplative recitation. What is the difference? When you do the superficial recitation, you are only doing the recitation in Arabic. Not necessarily you know the meaning. But you do it for the blessings, for the rewards, the benefits you see. So that has its place in Islam, in the Sharia, in Islam, because obviously we know there are many people who don't know Arabic. For whatever reason, they don't know the language and they might not have the time to even then learn the language. So that tadakkuri is without understanding, the superficial recitation. The contemplative recitation is the one where you read with understanding and you contemplate over the meanings of the Qur'an. So both of these have its place in the Sharia, in Islam. The tadakkuri is where, now this has become now two kind of extremes where some people only go to tadakkuri. That means entire life they're only reciting the Arabic Qur'an while they make no effort in understanding the meanings of what they are reciting. And how can that be achieved? Either you go to an English translation or you're going to learn the language. But you find there is no effort towards that. So that becomes one form of extremism, which is called the ifrat. The other form, which is the tafrit, where they are more relaxed. I mean, that's the ifrat. The tafrit one is obviously the tadabburi, the other extreme, that they would not recite the Qur'an if they do not understand Arabic. So they do not commit to the Arabic recitation, the reason being they do not understand Arabic. So they only read maybe the English translation. So that is the two extremes you find in today's time. Those that relate only to tadakkuri recitation, superficial, and those to contemplative recitation. The contemplative recitation, what we mean, because they don't know Arabic, or they don't know the Arabic language. They know how to read the Qur'an, but they do not know the Arabic language, the meanings of it. So they don't commit to recitation. And because of this second extreme you find that there were people in our history of Islam that fabricated hadith just to motivate people to recite Qur'an. And many ahadiths were then fabricated on the virtues of those surahs, like Nuh ibn Abi Maryam al-Jami'i. He said it very clear, that I did this in the interest of religion, so people can start, reading the surahs of the Qur'an. So surah after surah, he made fabrications of hadith. He attributed to the Prophet which was unfound. And it is said here, he says, I saw that the people had turned away from the Qur'an and were distracted by the fiqh of Abu Hanifa and Maghazi of Muhammad bin Ashaq. So I made up this hadith, seeing and thinking that I will be rewarded for it. And then you have Ibn Mahdi who said, I said to Maysara ibn Abi Rabihi, the other one who fabricated hadith, from where did you get these ahadith? Whoever recites such and such will have such and such. He said, I made them up in order to encourage the people to read these surahs of the Qur'an. So that is why the scholars of hadith had to scrutinize which are the authentic narrations, which are not the authentic narrations. For this reason, because of the fabrications that came into the house of Islam by these people in the early days of Islam. So what you find here is, what is the reasoning? Those that do not commit to recitation because they feel they do not understand the meaning, or they do not know Arabic. So they don't read the Quran at all. Whether it is in one khatam in the month, or whether it is in 20 days, whatever the case may be, in Ramadan or out of Ramadan. Because the analogy is they are treating the Quran as other books. And any other book, if you read it, you must understand it. So that is the first kind of reasoning they have. So they feel they must read with understanding. If they do not understand Arabic, they will not commit to the recitation of Qur'an. But those who say no, whether if you know Arabic, how to read Arabic, and you don't know the language, then too you should commit to recitation, because the Qur'an is not to be treated as any other book. You read without understanding is still beneficial. It's an act of ibadah by itself. It carries merits by itself. That is why the Qur'an is not like any other book. The Qur'an is shifa'un linnas, rahmatul linnas. That's why you read it in salah, and you only read it in Arabic. And for each letter you get, and this the Prophet gave a very beautiful example which gives a lot of support to this opinion, that you should still read the Qur'an even if you don't know the language of Arabic. Where the Prophet said you will get reward for each letter, and he gives the example of Alif Lam Mim. And when you look at Alif Lam Mim, these are the separated letters, the muqatta'at. For each letter the Prophet said you will be rewarded 10 rewards, 10 blessings. You read Alif 10, Lam 10, Mim 10, 30. You ask any person, what is the meaning of Alif Lam Mim? The most common answer you will get, Wallahu a'lam bi muradi. Allah knows best its meaning. Some gave suggested meanings that the Alif means Allah, the Lam can mean Latif of Allah's attribute, or it can mean Jibreel in the Lam in Jibreel, and the Mim can mean Majid as Allah's attribute, or it can mean Muhammad. Some said the Alif stands for the stone age. Some said the Lam stands for the middle age. The Mim stands for the modern age. And some said the Alif is for the past, the Lam is for present, the Mim is for future. But these are suggested meanings. Every Mufassir will tell you, Wallahu a'lam bi muradi. Because this is a secret that belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here the Prophet ﷺ is giving us the example of Alif Lam Mim, and you're getting reward when nobody knows the meaning. So the Qur'an is no ordinary book. It is Rahmah, Shafa, Hudan Linnas, Bayinati min Huda. It is dhikrullah. It forms as a form of wadhifa sometimes. So it is shifa in the physical sense when you have, and in the spiritual sense. Physically, ruqya is done. There's no other book you can do ruqya. A person has some, like Surah Fatiha, is shifa for people. Allah can give you shifa through reciting Surah Fatiha. There's no other book that can do this. It remedies you from the spiritual diseases of the heart. That is the Qur'an. It wants you to attain qalb salim. So it is very different from that. Another beautiful difference that scholars give is you'll find the hadith always speaks about qira'ah, not tilawah. And it's a very difficult question. The other day I asked Sheikh Ebrahim myself, how do you view the difference between qira'ah and tilawah? He said it is very difficult to make a distinction between the two, but he said qira'ah is more to do with private recitation and tilawah is to do with public recitation. This is the answer he gave just a few days ago. But some scholars then said qira'ah is recitation. Whether you know the meaning or not, whether you intending to contemplate or whether you want to practice, if you do qira'ah of Qur'an. Tilawah is recitation followed by practice. And that is why you will find there are certain Sahaba, it took so long for them to do hifz of the Qur'an, because they were doing tilawah with hifz. That means they memorize, they read, they memorize, and they practice. And then they move on to the next ayah. So that is how they approach the Qur'an. So this is what the scholar said, وَقَدْ ذَكَرَ بَعْضُهُمْ أَنَّ كَلِمَةِ التِّلَاوَةِ تَدُلُّ عَلَى الْإِتِّبَاعِ وَالْعَمَلِ أَيْضًا. That means you recite and you follow it up by following what you have recited and practice upon it. That becomes tilawah. But the hadith speaks of qira'ah. Qira'ah doesn't have these kind of elements. To conclude, brothers, inshallah, this will be given out after the Jumu'ah Salah. It's very short, but a beautiful writing on how to approach the Qur'an, and it answers the question, do you have to read it with knowing the meaning or not knowing the meaning? Very beautifully written by a particular scholar. Read it, and that inshallah ta'ala will answer your questions, and it should motivate us towards the recitation of the Qur'an. And at the end, there is no way, Okay, we'll complete that. Let's just go on to the moderation. So the moderate approach to the recitation of Qur'an is that we should commit to recitation while making effort to also understand it. Either you go to the translation, you read something of the Qur'an, look what Allah tells you in the language you know, or you start learning the Arabic language. Secondly, there's no excuse in today's day and age to learn how to read the Qur'an. Mujahid was a top student of Ibn Abbas who said, when people have two qualities, when they are proud or they are shy, this does not make them attain complete knowledge of Islam. For a Muslim, we know it's more to do with shyness, not our pride, because it's Islam. Islam is our religion. Many times people feel shy, for whatever reason, to go to somebody and learn how to read the Quran. So that should be no excuse in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the time we live today, but how much of access we have to different types of technology, etc. And lastly, the fact of the matter is qira'atul Quran qabla dirasatul Quran. You cannot gain the full sweetness of study of the Quran if you're not reciting the Quran. This is experienced by scholars who have recited the Quran, have committed to even Khatm al-Quran on a monthly basis, not only Ramadan. They will tell you the difference Allah gives you in understanding the Quran. This is experience from scholars who have committed to this. And this is Allah's sunnah, because the relationship that you develop with the Quran, the spiritual relationship, when you are reciting the Quran, that wahbi ilm that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that gifted knowledge enters the heart from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But you cannot get that if there's no qira'at al-Quran and you want to achieve dirasat al-Quran to the maximum. That is virtually impossible. That is why the Prophet said, "Iqra'il Qur'an fi kulli shahrin." Every month you should commit to the recitation of completing the Quran, of making khatm al-Quran. So we have discussed this Quranic growth. We move on now from a spiritual relationship. How do we develop an intellectual relationship with the Quran? Inshallah ta'ala, we will continue next week. Amin wa akhiru da'wana, and alhamdulillah.